Okay, we are going to get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Zuckerman, the author of the Book of Jeremiah, and welcome to the December Literary Modiin author event. Before we get started, I'll just say a few words of introduction. For those of you who aren't familiar, have not been to an event before, Modiin is a planned city in Israel about halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, right near the airport, so come visit. We have a large population of English speakers here in Modiin. So in June 2019, I started Literary Modiin as a way to bring local Israel-based authors to large community of English readers that we have here. We held a few in-person events, and then when the pandemic hit, we switched to a virtual format. And that allows us to hear from authors and welcome all of you from all over the world. And today's event is our 31st, so that's pretty cool, I think. The format of today's event is that each author will be speaking for about 15 minutes, and although with one exception today, and then we'll open it up to questions. We have a lot of people on the call today, so everyone's on mute, but you can put your questions in the chat box. And if you have any technical difficulties, just send a private note in the chat to me. As I said, we're broadcasting this live on Facebook and Literary Modiin, so in our group there, so feel free to start a watch party. Okay, so for the first time at Literary Modiin, we have a book written by two authors, and we're going to start with them. And then they're going to get a little bit more time because they're two people. I will introduce them and then let them take it away. Actually, I'll spotlight you guys as I'm speaking. And Shaunna, I'll add you. And let me read your introduction. Alyson Richman is the USA Today best-selling and #1 international best-selling author of several historical novels, including The Velvet Hours, The Garden of Letters, and The Lost Wife, which is currently in development for a major motion picture. Alyson graduated from Wellesley College with a degree in art history and Japanese studies. She herself is an accomplished painter, and her novels combine her deep love of art, historical research, and travel. Alyson lives on Long Island with her husband and 2 children, where she is currently at work on her next novel. Shaunna J. Edwards has a BA in literature from Harvard College and a JD from NYU School of Law. A former corporate lawyer, she now works in diversity, equity, and inclusion. She's a native Louisianian raised in New Orleans and currently lives in Harlem with her husband. The Thread Collectors is her first novel. It just came out on August 30th. You can find her on Instagram at Shaunna Edwards. And now I will unspotlight myself and let you guys take it away and ask if you need to unmute. Yes. Okay. And people are discussing it already in January, your book. Excellent. Okay. Take it away.
Thank you, Julie, for that lovely introduction, and we appreciate you spending part of your Sunday with us. Alyson and I want to talk to you a little bit about how the Thread Collectors came to be, and also our writing process, because it's unusual for there to be 2 of us in a collaboration. But for those of you who have not read the Thread Collectors, I first want to set the scene for you. So in the Thread Collectors, you're going to meet 2 couples, one Black couple and one Jewish couple. And the Black couple is comprised of William, who is enslaved. He's a brilliant musician, and he flees from New Orleans, where he is, to join the Union Army on the battlefields of Louisiana. William has a beloved. Her name is Stella, and she is also enslaved. Stella and William are not free to love, but they're meeting clandestinely. And also secretly, Stella is taking repurposed thread and cloth, and she's making these tactile mats for other enslaved men to flee to join the Union Army and fight for their freedom as well. On the battlefields of Louisiana, William meets Jacob, and Jacob is our Jewish hero. He's also a brilliant musician, so it's really this love of music that brings William and Jacob together. And Jacob has been encouraged to join the Union Army by his wife, Lily, who is up in New York City, and she is a fiery abolitionist. Lily is doing some sewing of her own. She has joined a quilting circle, and they are creating these quilts to sell to fund the Union Army. And it's really the relationship between Jacob and William and their shared love of music, which leads to friendship, which opens up the story between these 4 people. And you see how they survive and sometimes thrive during the war.
So what I'm going to contribute to the conversation about the Thread Collectors is, how did this come about this collaboration, what research, what family history that we brought to the project. Shaunna and I have been friends for over a decade. It's almost 13 years now. And our friendship has always been cemented in our mutual love of books. So for years, she would ask me what I was working on or what I was reading, and she would share what she was reading. I visited her book club, but it was always books, books, books. And in 2017, we met for a drink in New York City. She was living in DC at the time, and she'd come up, and I had just had an idea for a possible novel. And Shaunna, over the years, was always someone that when I had the first, genesis of an idea, I would always use Shaunna as a litmus test to see if she thought it was interesting, something that she might potentially want to read. And this idea was based on the Civil War. Now, something that is sort of unique to my own family history, I am 100% Jewish, but on my mother's side, her family emigrated from Germany in the late 1830s. And growing up, I had always heard from my grandmother that I had two great, great, great uncles who fought on opposite sides of the Civil War. One uncle went down to Mississippi in the late 1850s, early 1860s to start a mercantile depot in a place called Satarsha, Mississippi, while his younger brother remained in New York. And when the war broke out, the Southern uncle enlisted in the Confederacy, while his younger brother enlisted as a musician in the Union Army. And according to my grandmother, this position between the two brothers permanently divided the family forever, and that her side of the family lost contact with the Southern side, and she always described it as if the family was permanently broken. So in the back of my mind, I think I always thought that fraternal relationship between the two brothers was something that would be very interesting to potentially mine in a novel, particularly because they were Jewish, which during the time of the Civil War, only 0.5% of the United States population was Jewish. 8,000 Jewish soldiers fought during the Civil War, but that was a very, very small percentage when you think about, 188,000 Black men enlisted in the Civil War. So back in 2017, when I met Shaunna for a drink, I had just seen a Civil War documentary by Rick Burns, Ken Burns' younger brother, called Death in the Civil War. It was on PBS. And this documentary highlighted two things that I was not familiar with. One, that, as I mentioned before, over 180,000 Black men enlisted at great risk to themselves, some of them, escaping enslavement, the risk of being caught by slave captors. And when they arrived at the enlistment camps, instead of being given muskets to fight as they had hoped, they were given pickaxes and hoes and forced to do all sorts of demeaning and menial work, not fighting bravely like their white soldiers, even though they wanted to desperately. Another thing that the documentary highlighted was that because over 600,000 men perished during the Civil War, there was a tremendous amount of death. The dead had to be buried quickly. That responsibility fell onto the shoulders of the Black soldiers. And sometimes maps were created by fellow soldiers in the hope that after the war finished, that these maps could lead the family members back up north, back to where their fallen soldiers had been buried hastily, and have them buried close to their family. And so these maps were, sometimes made on very fragile pieces of paper, on the back of, scraps of paper, in backs of letters, on journal entry, journal books. But the idea of a map and the idea of perhaps a Black soldier creating a map occurred to me. I thought that was very interesting. I also had this flash of an idea that perhaps a Black soldier and a white soldier, a white Jewish soldier, might be able to find friendship on the battlefield, and that a map could lead into the plot somehow. So when I said that to Shaunna immediately had some of her own ideas.
Absolutely. Well, I thought it was incredibly intriguing. I am originally from Louisiana, and I don't know if it's because you grow up in the South, but the Civil War has always felt very present to me. I was immediately intrigued by the idea of the Black soldier, and don't worry, we're not giving away any spoilers here for those of you who haven't read it. But I was thinking about this map, and I said, well, what if the Black soldier gives the map to his beloved. And she uses cloth and thread and creates a map that's more able to withstand, the time. And this idea in my head is probably drawn from my history. I couldn't have told you then because it just popped in my head, like the way good ideas do. I am not a quilt maker, but in my family, I am privileged to have these quilts that come from like my grandmother and my great grandmother, the African American tradition, as in many traditions. It really has a rich history of quilt making, and people may not have much, but taking this cloth and preserving it, you create something that's both utilitarian, which a map has to be, but also artistic and beautiful. And it was a super intriguing idea, but we didn't write it then. Alyson says that the wind has to be at your back. And at the time, while I was a literature major and writing a book is definitely on my bucket list, I wouldn't have thought like, oh yeah, let's collaborate on this. Like who has who has the moxie to say that to like a good friend who is an established author? It wasn't until 2020 when we were in the pandemic and George Floyd had been murdered, and we were dealing with a lot of racial tension and strife, that Alyson reached out to me and offered me the idea of really contributing something that we would go on to call our legacy project, something that would be about building bridges, something that would be about hearkening back to the most racially divisive time in the US history, but also as a way to heal through what I think some of us are still very worried is a very divisive time in our current history. So in 2020 was when we came together to write The Thread Collectors. But maybe Alyson, you can tell them a little bit about our writing process, because everyone's always like, you've got two folks, how does this work?
So when we finally got together, it was actually on Juneteenth in 2020. It was the first time I traveled outside my house since the pandemic began, and took the Long Island Railroad to a park called Bryant Park near the New York Public Library. And Shaunna and I pulled down our masks and started dreaming about the book, and also drawing from where we wanted to use the reserve inside ourselves, our hearts and our minds of our family heritages. This idea that we were going to draw from our ancestry, from the stories handed down to us, or things that were even mysteries with our own families, things that we wanted to work out, was very dear to us. And I think at that moment, we also decided we definitely didn't want to create a book where one of us was writing the Black characters and one of us was writing the white characters. To us, that seemed antithetical up to what the whole project was. Right away, we named this our legacy project. It was something in the depths of great darkness with the pandemic and this racial tension that Shaunna mentioned, that we wanted to create something that was going to bridge the divide, that was going to be healing, that was going to show the humanity within all of us. And so having two different people working on different voices, to us didn't seem like it was the way to write a cohesive narrative. So what we decided we were going to do was to brainstorm every weekend what our characters were going to do to accomplish. And we would talk deeply about these are how I see this character, or what I think that she would do at this point. And then on Monday, I would start sketching out what we like to describe as a wire armature. For those of you who are artistic, when people make sculptures, sometimes there's this very thin wire that's used to suggest the structure of a model that an artist is working on. So that wire structure I would sort of sketch out, and then I would let Shaunna know that it was up there, and then she would start adding her first layer of clay and filling in, and then I would go back and I would add another layer of clay. And I would say that each chapter went through maybe 3 to 4 different layerings before we each felt it accomplished how we saw that particular scene, and we felt comfortable with it. It's really funny because we had no idea that we both were perfectionists that wouldn't move on to the next chapter until it was as perfect as possible. Having been on panels with other authors, I know there are a lot of people who just like to do a really big, messy first draft and then go back and polish. We were not that, kind of collaboration. We just were refining and polishing and then moving on. And so that was how we did it. And Shaunna, you can also talk a little bit about how we added like messages or things that we wanted to discuss. And it was always this dialogue, right, between us.
Sorry, I inappropriately muted myself. Absolutely. And then I noted that there was one question that I'll answer quickly. It is already in paperback. It is in libraries, and there is a discussion guide. And the discussion guide for us was important because a lot of the things that are in the discussion guide were the questions that Alyson and I were answering between ourselves. So Alyson spoke about how we were really writing simultaneously. We were also researching simultaneously, which was so important. I did a lot of research. I was able to go home to Louisiana during the pandemic and spend time with my mother, whose name is Stella. Our Black heroine is named after her, and really delve into records about the everyday lives of Black people in antebellum New Orleans. I was able to go to Port Hudson. Port Hudson is a place where a lot of Black soldiers finally were allowed the opportunity to fight really bravely in 1863. It's 90 minutes from my house, but I had never been there. And some of our most poignant scenes between William and Jacob take place there. And then ultimately, Alice and I were even able to take a trip together to the Gullah Islands, which is where William, our Black hero, is born. And we were able to see like how they harvested indigo, you know, the fact that there are still vestiges of African languages there. So we're always writing simultaneously. We're always researching simultaneously. And I have to say, I think it was that just total immersion between us, both from the research side of the house and also from the writing side of the house, that allowed us to write The Thread Collectors. I think one thing I can say is my mother, when she read it, I said, "Mom, can you tell what I wrote and what Alyson might have written?" And she said, "Not at all." And for me, I think that was a really, really great compliment because Alyson and I, our mothers, share a lot of traits, but they do not pull any punches. I want to be mindful of time. What we'd like to do is read from chapter 2 of the book. And to set the stage, William has already escaped from New Orleans, and he's trying to make his way about 10 miles outside of New Orleans to Camp Parapet, which is where he hopes to join the Union Army. And this is a real place, right? You could drive there and you could see the marker. We were very careful on our research. Camp Parapet, Jefferson, Louisiana. The 10 miles journey from New Orleans to the Army camp that was perched between Lake Pontchartrain and the river had been treacherous and lengthy. William avoided all roads at any cost, regardless of whether they were dirt or paved. He didn't know when his mask would discover that he had fled, but he was all too aware of the slave catchers' camps right outside the city. Any man they captured would suffer greatly, lashes that ripped the skin off their back, fleur-de-lis brands marking the bearer as untrustworthy. And for those with particularly brutal masters, with enough slaves to spare, bodies doused with kerosene and lit on fire, their burning flesh a reminder to the others on the plantation that it was never worth it to run. He took the route that Stella had advised, first through the swampland, then hugging the bayous and creeping through boggy marshes and wetlands that had to be navigated to reach higher ground. The roots of bald cypress trees and tupelo gums intertwined beneath the murky water of the ravines, causing William to stumble countless times. He had nearly been caught 3 times since he'd left Stella, but he kept running, hearing her voice in his head urging him on. He was driven by his mother's spirit too, each stretched towards freedom, defying those who robbed her of her song. In the hour right before dawn, the sound of barking dogs was dangerously close. He threw himself into the fetid water, hoping to evade the bloodhounds, shivering until the patrollers finally moved away. He reached the enlistment camp by daybreak, where he found hundreds of men already in line, eager to join the Union cause. Some had traveled for days, through back alleys of the more dangerous open fields. Like William, all of them had to evade mercenaries eager to beat and shackle them before returning them to their masters for a rich reward. The man in front of William stood barefoot, the cuffs of his pants reduced to a ragged edge of fringe. Fingers balled at his side, he inched up the snaking line to the medical surgeon's tent, leaving a stamp of blood with each step. The dry earth, greedy for every ounce of moisture, drank the man's stark footprint almost instantly, only to have it replaced with another. Next, outside the mouth of the tent's entrance, one of the Union soldiers waved another man inside. William looked down at his own narrow feet. The pair of waterlogged and sweat-stained calfskin Oxfords he had on were not the typical shoes of a contraband man running from slavery. His herringbone trousers had a gash down the side, His tweed jacket was ripped at the elbow, and somewhere between New Orleans and Jefferson County, he had lost his hat. Yet despite his harrowing journey, his shoes remained miraculously intact. Inside his jacket, tucked within the pocket of his waistcoat, he located the handkerchief Stella had embroidered. He surreptitiously ran his fingers over the small flower sheet stitched carefully with blue thread. Even now, with the stench of rotten death heavy in the air, the buzzing of flies and the intense hunger in his belly, thoughts of Stella were his constant companions. He brought the white cotton cloth to his nose and inhaled it, desperately searching for the last traces of her distinct scent. William knew breath was not something that always came from the lungs, but could break forth from the heart and mind as well, filling a body with life when it needed it most.
In the corner of the tent where William was told to undress, Jacob Kling sat bent over a thick ledger. Dark curls sprouted from beneath his navy cap, and a smudge of black ink stained his index finger as he recorded the medical surgeon's clinical observations about the prior recruit. 22 years old, Negro, 5'9", weight 175 pounds. Despite superficial wound to left foot, a solid build and determined spirit, qualified for military duty. The medical surgeon chose his words carefully when Jacob first arrived at the examination tent to assist with the note-taking. It's a very sorry situation. We can't accept every man who wants to join up, despite the lengths they may have taken to get here. He explained as he opened his black leather physician's bag and arranged his tools on a side table. The Army asked me to separate out the strong from the weak. I have given up trying to determine whether a man is a fugitive, the doctor remarked, noting the futility of dividing the recently emancipated from those who had fled from bondage. Remember, these men will not be lifting muskets, but rather wielding shovels, pickaxes, and hoes. We can only take the ones who are free from both bodily defects and have sufficient sense to follow orders. He cleared his throat and pulled at his ash-colored beard. In other words, Private Kling, my job is rather straightforward. It is not to choose who is in every way good, but to reject who is positively unfit. The doctor always began his examinations with each candidate's head, ears, and eyes, and then continued on to inspect their teeth, neck, and chest. He also checked their hands and feet over carefully. Earlier that morning, a young man had taken off his shirt, and both Jacob and the doctor had found it impossible to keep their composure when they saw a thick blanket of scar tissue covering the man's back. The man tried to bring his hands above his head, but the painful scars limited his range of motion. His arms only lifted halfway, his hands barely reaching the level of his ears. Now, as William entered the tent, the doctor readjusted his focus. His eyes fell on William's shoes and his once elegant but now damaged clothes. Don't just stand there. Get undressed so I can examine you. William placed down his satchel, removed his jacket, and slowly began to unbutton his vest and shirt. He knew he was far slighter than nearly every other man in line that afternoon, having never worked a field. His body had not obtained the thick ropes of muscles his fellow slaves had developed. Instead, when he had been 6 years old, he had been plucked from his mama's pallet and delivered to the big house to amuse the master's wife with his nascent talent. The doctor placed a stethoscope upon William's chest. Heart and lungs clear, the doctor said. Slight build, fit for service. He turned over William's palms. How oddly free of calluses, he murmured underneath his breath. Any skills? Musician, sir, William answered quietly, but the doctor was no longer listening. Okay, that's it for us.
That was amazing, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you for letting us share with you.
Okay, I have lots of questions, and as you can see, a lot of people in the chat have already read the book and or will be reading it with their book club, so that is great. Okay, I am going to introduce our next author, Anca Szilágyi. I'm probably not pronouncing your last name properly, sorry. Is a Brooklynite living in Chicago. Her writing appears in Lilith, Orion Magazine, and Los Angeles Review of Books, among other publications. She is the author of Daughters of the Air, which Shelf Awareness called a striking debut from a writer to watch, and the Seattle Review of Books called a creation of unearthly talents. Dreams of Glass, her second novel, was just published in September 2022. So, Anca, take it away. I will place your spotlight and ask you to unmute.
Thank you so much, Julie. Yeah, my name is a lot easier to pronounce if you just forget how it's spelled. That Z and that Y and I know it's all a little nerve-wracking. Yeah, Szilágyi, thank you so much for having me and for that introduction. And Shaunna and Alyson, it was really fascinating to hear about your collaboration. So my book is Dreams Under Glass. And it tells the story of Binnie Greenson, a 25-year-old self-sabotaging diorama artist. Say that 5 times fast. And she's grappling with a day job she hates during the economic crisis of 2008. She's working as a paralegal for a scrappy boutique law firm in the Lipstick Building, which is this iconic pink glass tower in Midtown Manhattan in New York City, which is also where the Bernie Madoff scandal exploded. And actually, this weekend is the anniversary of his arrest. And so that time and setting is inspired by my time working as a paralegal during the economic crisis of 2008 in the Lipstick Building when the Bernie Madoff scandal exploded. But the autobiographical material more or less stops there. Fortunately for me, I, unlike Binnie, did not witness a shocking and surreal death in the workplace, and I did not have to wonder whether one of my bosses has been murdered. So that's the setting, and well, I'm Jewish and Binnie is Jewish, so there is that autobiographical connection. But a lot of my characters, kind of by default, are Jewish, unless I'm writing a historic figure that was known to not be Jewish. My next novel is about a late medieval Netherlandish painter who was definitely not Jewish. But in Dreams Under Glass, in Dreams Under Glass, many of the characters are Jewish of different backgrounds and different walks of life. Binnie grew up middle class in central Brooklyn. She's of Ashkenazi heritage. Her mom is an administrative assistant at the Board of Ed. Her dad is a carpenter. Her friend and love interest, Gary, is of Iraqi Jewish lineage. And both Binnie and Gary are millennials saddled with a lot of student loan debt, which is discussed in the book, which the economic crisis really starts to show in stark contrast to this world of money that Binnie is working in and is new to, right? As she's new to, she's taken this job because she needs it, but she's not been in this world before. And her bosses, the 3 lawyers that she works for, are also Jewish or half Jewish, living on the East Side, in walking distance from the office, and one of them is working in living in Chappaqua. So these different backgrounds were important to me. In part, of course, we're not a monolith, right? The Jewish people were diverse from different places and different backgrounds. But with the Bernie Madoff scandal exploding in the book, we also get different reactions, but also a shared anxiety about stereotypes about Jews and money, and a shared anxiety about a spike in anti-Semitism as a result of that news. And even Ziman, one of the lawyers, he's a child of a Holocaust survivor, and very dryly says at that point in the book, that's not going to be good for the Jews. The excerpt I would like to read introduces 2 ghostly figures in the book that are not characters, Binnie's great aunt Ruby and the artist Joseph Cornell. So Binnie, at the beginning of the book, lives in this unicorn of a New York apartment. It's a rent-controlled pre-war apartment that great aunt Ruby has passed down to her. And one of the reasons I mentioned that Binnie is 25 was that I was interested in the idea I had learned at the time when I was writing the book that the brain develops executive function around age 25, right? So that's a decision-making skill. So Binny makes some pretty poor decisions in the book in her desire to be independent of her overbearing mother, and in her desire to try to make a life for herself as an artist. She gives up that rent-controlled apartment, which is her mother sees as a huge betrayal. But I wanted to introduce Great Aunt Ruby in this excerpt, and also Joseph Cornell. If you don't know, he was a surreal artist working from the late 1920s to the early 1970s in New York. He lived in Queens, and he made these dioramas and collages that were very dreamy. So he would take these wooden boxes that he would try to, he would make them look old, and then he would fill them with found objects and Victorian illustrations of romantic ballerinas and opera singers and Renaissance princes. He was nostalgic for a time before him, and Binny is nostalgic for Joseph Cornell's work. She's nostalgic for a time before her. She does not want to be in New York in 2008. So she's looking to his life for some kind of guidance in her path toward becoming an artist. And the last thing I'll say in terms of setting up the excerpt is that so at the start of the book, she's just spent 2 weeks in Wilmington, Delaware, which a coworker of hers calls corporate America's Wild, Wild West. She was working on a trial. It was litigation around a casino bankruptcy. And she felt that they were on the wrong side of the lawsuit, but is also kind of hating for herself for being disappointed that her side has lost. She didn't want to sympathize, but she did. And so she's been doing, 14-hour work days for 2 weeks. She gets 1 weekend at home, and now it's Monday morning and she's got to go back to work. So yeah, I think that's it in terms of setup. So chapter 2. Sunlight warmed Binny's pale, thin forearm. A metal keypad surgically implanted there, she imagined sleepily, could thwart reveries with electric zaps. The zaps would travel up her arm, which arranged and rearranged disparate objects into dream boxes, flotsam a la Joseph Cornell, cheap toys, hard candy, vintage cutouts, things grasping at wonder. And by entering her brain, kill the desire to make art. One could devise a quasi-Victorian design for such a contraption, wires entwining with nerves all the way up to the frontal lobe. Zip, there goes your inner life. Zap, back to work. She descended into the subway with Utopia Parkway, a biography of Cornell that she read intermittently, hoping it would help her find her own path. He, too, had an overbearing mother. His day jobs gave him headaches and stomach aches, just like Binny's. His diary entries chronicled airy lunches, red jam rolls, lemon cake, chocolate egg creams. Aunt Ruby could have been one of the girls lunching in automats that Cornell brooded over, prim and oblivious to him. When she used to lean in to kiss Binny as a girl, she'd smelled of rose perfume and cold cream. The first time Aunt Ruby ever opted not to pinch her cheek was after her bat mitzvah. Binny hadn't wanted a bat mitzvah. She hated the idea of standing before her peers on the bema, her dress from Sears scrutinized, and later her temple basement party so sad compared to others' splashy affairs. Custom t-shirts torpedoed out of a cannon, a Noah's Ark-themed cruise around Manhattan, an Absolute Vodka ad-themed shindig at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. Arlene had been appalled at the latter, a bad girl boast. In any case, Arlene begged Benny to have a bat mitzvah for Aunt Ruby's sake, Benny being the closest thing to a granddaughter she could ever have. So she did. Aunt Ruby, dark bobbed hair, perfectly sleek, expertly lined eyes, watering, kveld and kveld. As she marched up the grimy steps from the subway platform, a little ball of hate the size of a marble stuck in her throat. The sort of quiet hate a child feels for a place they do not wish to go but must. To work, to battle for money, not hers. The bustle of Midtown on a Monday morning was in stark contrast to the prior 2 weeks. The darkened windows of downtown Wilmington's old stone buildings had summoned Cornell's haunted palace in setting for a fairy tale. A crowd of thin white trees rising up behind its gabled roof, stark against an inky black sky. In Wilmington, the spookiness was real. Boarded up retail and for-lease signs dismal. Panhandlers grimmer than New York's homeless. With so few people on the street, who would seek charity in such a city? The marble of hate slunk to Benny's stomach. She envisioned a diorama in the shape of a Beaux-Arts bank, its roof caving in. The diorama would sit on a low pedestal so that you could look down the hole in its top. And a mirror inside, angled just so, would make the darkness infinite. Title, Black Hole. I think I'll stop there.
That was great. That was great. Okay, I'm sure people have a lot of questions for you, but they can put them in the chat. Let me introduce our next author. Ellen Meeropol. This is not her first time at Literary Modiin. Ellen was actually at our very first virtual event back in, I think it was April or May of 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. So Ellen is the author of the novels The Lost Women of Azalea Court, Her Sister's Tattoo, Kinship of Clover on Hurricane Island and House Arrest, and The Plague Gridlock. Her essay and short story publications include Ms. Magazine, Lilith, The Writer Magazine, Lit Hub, Guernica, and the Boston Globe. Her work has been a finalist for the Sarton Prize, longlisted for the Massachusetts Book Award, and a group read selection of the Women's National Book Association. Ellen is a founding mother of Straw Dog Writers Guild, which I want to hear about, and lives in Northampton, Massachusetts. So Ellen, I will spotlight you now, and please tell us about The Lost Women of Azalea Court.
Thank you so much, Julie. And what a pleasure to read with you, Anca and Shaunna and Alyson. I'm excited to share with you my new novel, The Lost Women of Azalea Court, and focus on 2 craft challenges I faced in shaping this story. The Lost Women of Azalea Court is fiction, but it's set in a real place, the grounds of Northampton State Hospital. It's a was a public asylum for people with mental illness that operated in my town in Northampton, Massachusetts for 135 years. It closed almost 35 years ago. Most of the buildings have been demolished and a neighborhood created of homes, condos, affordable housing, rentals, and nonprofits. Actually, the first chapters I wrote of this book were set elsewhere. They weren't working. There was no juice in those pages. Then I moved to a condo on the hospital grounds. The window behind my computer looks out at Building 9, the old coach house, the oldest hospital building still standing. I felt the presence of those ruins very strongly, and I imagined the voices of the people who lived there and worked there. As I learned about the hospital, its history, its effect on the town, I imagined those ghosts whispering to me. "Set your story here," they said. "Tell our story." So I did. The novel takes place over 2.5 days in November 2019, 26 years after the last patients were transferred out. It begins when 88-year-old Iris Blum goes missing from the bungalow she shares with her husband, Dr. Asher Blum. He was the last head psychiatrist of the hospital, serving for 40 years and then overseeing the closing of the institution. In the novel, Dr. Blum is writing a book about the treatment of mental illness, titled "What We Thought We Knew." So this novel is grounded in 135 years of history, difficult, often shameful history. Given that, the story demanded a process very different from my previous novels. In my other books, I always wrote a first draft just entirely from imagination to discover the story. And then I went back and did the revisions and did the research in order to flesh it out, make sure I didn't get things wrong, go deeper in many situations. In this case, I knew too little, and the actual history felt too important, too critical, too central to the story. So I had to kind of write and research simultaneously with emphasis on the research part. I did 3 kinds of research. All 130 years of annual hospital reports have now been digitized, so I could read every word, including how many bushels of potatoes were harvested by the hospital farm every year. I also dug into the archives at the local library and historic association, extensive archives. And I was able to interview people who had worked at the hospital, from care attendants to social workers and psychiatrists, and to people who had been patients or family members. I learned 3 main things. First, that the hospital started with incredibly lofty goals. It was part of what was called the moral treatment movement, which believed that removing an individual from the environment that made them ill, putting them in a beautiful spot, giving them work to do, and treating them with kindness would cure them. Well, it didn't. The hospital's mission failed due to lack of understanding about mental illness, its causes, how to treat it, but equally because of incredible overcrowding and underfunding. I also learned that in addition to the mentally ill, the hospital was a dumping ground for what one former patient called the inconvenient people, the poor, the homeless, and especially for people, mostly women, who did not fit into the expected social roles. That brings me to the first challenge: how to deeply explore the history without getting bogged down by it. Novelists always have to balance details, just enough to make it feel authentic, not too much. And that's particularly true when we're writing something with a historic element. But in this case, I wanted to emphasize, almost to honor, the history. I came up with the device of short historical snapshots, mostly from the archives, to begin each section of the novel. The device I used is that these were part of the book Dr. Blum is writing. Some of these excerpts are historical, informational, some are provocative. I want to read a couple of them for you. They're very short. This first one comes from the Northampton State Hospital annual report in 1858. Friday afternoon, what we thought we knew. Table number 5 shows the supposed causes of insanity in 44 cases. Intemperance, 8. Masturbation, 5. Disappointment in love, 3. Pecuniary embarrassment, 2. Hard study, 2. Pupil, 2. Religious excitement, 1. The second example is, lest we think that the folks running the hospital back then didn't get it. This is from Dr. Pliny Earle, Northampton State Hospital Superintendent, 1880. Saturday morning, what we thought we knew. It appears to the present writer that there is about as close an analogy between pneumonia and insanity as there is between a broken bone and a broken promise. The novelist Dalma Llanos Figueroa writes that, quote, history reflects life from the outside in. Fiction reflects life from the inside out. One focuses on events, the other on the effect of those events on characters, unquote. That brings us to the characters. The novel centers on Iris and Asher Blum, an elderly Jewish couple. They came of age in the 1950s during the McCarthy Red Scare. Iris is a 1950s wife and mother, but also a woman with deep secrets. Asher is a man who experienced trauma as a child in Nazi Europe and then did some bad things to protect his family. But ultimately, it's the story of a group of people who, when faced with loss and fear, find connection to each other. So the second challenge was to create a structure that would echo and enhance that theme of isolated people coming together. What emerged is what I think of as an ensemble piece, a novel told in 15 voices, plus a Greek chorus of the women of Azalea Court. That structure of many voices, separate and together, became a way to mirror the theme. I wanted the reader to join me and this group of characters. I wanted all of us with very different backstories to be in this together. So in addition to the Greek chorus, 15 characters narrate, including 12 people who live on Azalea Court, the detective assigned to the case, Lexi, the middle-aged daughter of Asher and Iris, and a homeless woman who parks her car nearby. I'm going to read two short excerpts. This first one is narrated by the women of Azalea Court. We all had mixed up feelings that afternoon as the detectives came around to our front doors, asking questions, probing neighborhood history, poking around in our piles of dead leaves and moldy secrets. On the one hand, Iris was one of us, and we all worried about her, even those of us who had no use for her husband. On the other hand, well, no one likes police officers sticking their noses into their private business, right? The detectives went door to door. Some of us welcomed them into our homes, having nothing to hide. Others were less hospitable, not necessarily because of guilt, more often because of previous bad experiences with authority figures with guns, or perhaps just a suspicious personal bent. In any case, we were all invested in Iris being found quickly and unharmed, both for her sake and so the peacefulness of our little enclave could continue. We did, however, begin to look at each other a little differently, even this early in the game, wondering what that neighbor knew and wasn't saying, or maybe was saying, and would it somehow implicate one of us in Iris's disappearance? What kind of gossip might be being spread? We all hated to be suspicious of our neighbors, but under the circumstances, can you blame us? And I'll end with a bit from the detective. Detective McPhee. She knew that her intuitive methods were sometimes the butt of jokes back at the station, but who cared as long as she got results? Still, she was a bit embarrassed about sitting on the porch of number 2 Azalea Court in one of the twin pink Adirondack rocking chairs, contemplating an imaginary conversation with the missing woman. With each passing hour, finding her alive and unharmed got less likely. By all reports, Iris Blum had been a competent elderly woman, even if her husband's diagnosis of dementia was correct. She didn't deserve to end a long life like that. Damn, here she was, thinking of Mrs. Blum in that pesky past tense. You slipped into it so easily, and it never failed to undo the people left behind after an accident or whatever this was. She wasn't ready to give up on Mrs. Blum, not yet. She would conjure her up, picture the woman right next to her in the matching pink rocker. The missing woman would be wearing a blue hooded jacket, zipped tight against the November morning chill. "Good morning, Iris," McPhee said quietly. "May I call you Iris?" "Certainly, dear. We're doing everything we can to help you." "Thank you. I appreciate your results. Is there anything you'd like to share with me off the record? Any clues to help me find you?" Imaginary Iris half smiled. "What if I don't want to be found? Will you still help me?" McPhee sat up straight. What if, indeed? Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. That was great. That was great. Okay, I am gonna add all our authors back to the spotlight and ask you all to unmute. And I had to add myself. Let's see. Add your questions to the chat. I see there's a few that were in here. So we'll start with the one that I see, and I have a few myself. The first question is for Anca. Can you tell us more about what inspired you to write Dreams Under Glass and setting it in 2008? You mentioned some autobiographical overlap with the main character.
Yeah. Thank you, Lucy, for that question. So I was working in the lipstick building in 2008, and I'm very interested in place, in cities, in architecture. And so when I was working in the lipstick building, which is sort of elliptical in shape, and it was very cool to be on the 30th floor and to get views of the city. I think there was probably a very dismal, snowy day where I was watching the wind whip around the building, which was like visually very interesting, where I thought, well, I've got to do something with this somehow one day. And I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I think I was reading Bleak House by Dickens. I was like, well, like maybe it'll have to be related to someone working in a law firm. I'm not sure what it's going to be, but that's kind of how it started, where I was like, well, this is a material that has to be used somehow. And certainly, you know, like living through the time of the Bernie Madoff scandal, well, certainly there's plenty of news around it, but Alan, just as you said, like history is about events and fiction is about characters' reactions to events, right? This was a chance to also digest what had happened. And initially, I mean, the Bernie Madoff stuff wasn't a huge part of the book, and it's not like all of the book. There's a lot of other stuff that happens. But it seemed like, you know, I'm interested in history. And it's kind of funny to think about 2008. It's not exactly historic fiction, but my editor and I talked about writing a period piece, right? So I was thinking about like, well, you know, now that I was revising in 2000, well, it must have been 2020, 2021, like, well, what was 2008? Like, okay, some people had iPhones, you know, so getting into those little details too. But really, yeah, it started, I guess, with the architecture, right? The unique architecture and the viewpoint, right? Seeing Queens kind of going out forever, and capturing that as well, because she looks out to Queen, you know, Joseph Cornell grew up on Utopia Parkway, which of course you have to use that place name, out in Queens. It becomes like this fantasy land to her of like, what's out there, like for me. So yeah.
Thanks. Okay, next question is one that kind of I jotted down while Alyson and Shaunna were talking, and then Ellen, you also like I have the same question for you, and maybe Anca too if you did research, but it's all about you all three of you mentioned doing the research while you're doing the writing. So I was wondering if, which I find is, I mean, I also do that, but it's also a challenge because like, what if you think the story is going to go one way and then you uncover something in your research and like, oh my God, that can't happen. that didn't happen. So I don't want to, you know, how did you deal with that? Did that happen to you? In fact, that you thought things were going to go one way for your characters and then you uncovered something in the research that made you have to go back and revise. So if you could touch on that.
Well,
So maybe go ahead.
I know which one we're going to cite. So for Shaunna and I think there was a certain amount of research we did before we started writing. And that really involved was our initial premise that a Black soldier and a white Jewish soldier could meet on the battlefield. Could a friendship, even if we cemented on their mutual love of music, could that actually plausibly happen? And so we reached out first to an academic at Columbia University who specialized in Civil War Black history. And at first she was a little bit cautious and she was like, I'm actually not even sure if that would be possible unless your character, William, had some sort of ties with the 54th Regiment of Massachusetts. And, you know, perhaps that had given him the opportunity to then circle back. And when he's in Louisiana, have a friendship with this white soldier. But we kept on doing research. And finally, we found this book that focused on musicians during the Civil War. And one of the things that we learned was that white musicians, because they had more free time than often just regular battlement soldiers, assisted the Surgeon General with enlistment, with the medical intake of potential soldiers. And so when we wrote back to her and she said, you know, our characters are going to be musicians and we think that our character Jacob could be in the tent when William enlists and that he could overhear, you know, this conversation about that he's a musician, would that work? And she said, absolutely yes. And so once we knew that the overall arching premise of their friendship worked, we were then able to start developing that. And then because as Shaunna mentioned, we had, you know, the luxury of having two brains working on research. She could be in the fields of Louisiana, going to Port Hudson. I could be in New York, looking at what Lily might be experiencing during the Civil War and having that go through the letters. We were able to break up the research in tandem while we were also writing our chapters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to answer that question too, if I could, Julie, because when you do research, especially archival research, you never know what you're going to come up with. And there were actually two things I could not find answers to. And they were driving me crazy because they were really important for the plot. The first thing was that I could not discover what it actually took legally to commit a person to a mental hospital against their will in the 1950s. In the 60s, late 60s, the laws changed and it's really clear and there's judicial review. But in the 50s, it was just murky, and a day spent at the law library didn't help. And I finally spoke to the attorney who had been instrumental in bringing the suit that eventually led to the closing of the hospital. And I said to him, could it have happened this way? And described what was happening in my book. And he said, yes, it could have happened that way. And so I said, okay, this is good enough for fiction. This is the world we work in as fiction writers. The second thing was that even though, as I mentioned, I can tell you how many bushels of potatoes and onions were harvested every year from the farm that fed the hospital, I could not find any information about how many women became pregnant at the hospital, how many patients, and what happened to their infants. And the inability to find that out really changed the course of the book. It changed my plot. I was just so fascinated by it. So there's both risk in doing research while you're writing, and also, I think, huge benefit to just staying open to let your imagination and the research work together.
100%. I'm gonna make a plea here. Is anybody on the line? I'm facing a kind of similar challenge with something I'm working on now about. So if anyone here on the call has some knowledge of what of World War II nursing in Europe, and what might have happened if a nurse in the army became pregnant, let me know, because I'd like to find out. Anyway, okay, but back to the books that we're discussing tonight. There were a bunch of other questions in the chat. So let's see, Shaunna and Alyson, what was the hardest part of writing together? Did you ever have major disagreements about the direction of the characters? You probably get that question often.
I'll wade in here. I think everybody wants to find some kind of like hair-pulling episode. It absolutely did not happen, because from the very beginning, Alyson and I were very clear that we had to listen to each other, particularly when it came from our cultural perspective. You know, we're both marginalized people writing about a time that was pretty intense, and that's going to bring up emotions. It's going to bring up different ways of encountering things. I'll tell you two quick vignettes that happened that for us really encapsulated this idea that words are so important. There is a scene in the book, I'm not going to tell you what it is, but it's about 2/3 of the way in, and there is a young Black girl that has very crucial information that she needs to give to an adult. And when Alyson had taken this first pass, she had described the adult as being surprised that this young Black girl would have the information. And I immediately put in one of my let's discuss flags. And the way that I had heard it, you know, being a Black woman and sometimes being faced some type of stereotypes like, oh, I didn't know you would know that, or something like that. That was the way it was hitting my ears, where Alyson was coming at it from a perspective like, it would just be interesting that a child would have this information. And after we talked about it, she was like, I get it. I get your perspective. We found another word. It was literally just changing the word surprised, but I felt seen and heard. And then there was a similar instance that happened from Alyson's perspective. We only have one scene in the book where our Jewish brothers are actually talking about the Civil War and enslavement, and it takes place over a Passover dinner, and which is such like a really poignant time to be talking about slavery and how the two brothers feel. And when we were first talking about the scene, before any words hit the paper, I started talking about how I envision the scene where the Southern Jewish brother would really be focusing on the economics of the situation, wanting to protect his growing mercantile empire. And Alyson stopped me and she said, I'm very uncomfortable with that. I'm uncomfortable with playing into this kind of stereotype that Jewish people are like, overly fixated on money and monetary things. And I was like, I never would have thought about it from that perspective. I get it. Let's find another way in. And so I've been calling it kind of like the shut up and listen principle. Like we didn't really have all of these fights because we had agreed to just shut up and listen. And so it was more education and exposition and being honest and brave as opposed to, knock down, drag out disagreements.
And it was also about learning, as she mentioned, like about language and sensitivity of how one ear hears a word differently. So I think we both came, at the end of the project feeling that we were so enriched by learning each other's perspectives and having now a sensitivity towards language like that.
I love that you called it your legacy project, and and what a gift you guys have had, like to have this relationship and this creative collaboration. It sounds amazing. Like, wow, somebody to brainstorm my ideas with. like I love that. Okay. There were some other questions here for Anca. I wondered whether this is actually is asking. I wondered whether you had any thoughts to share about the recurring ant figure in your novels. If not, that's fine too.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Ashley, for that. Yeah. So in my first novel, Daughters of the Air, there's an Aunt Lolo who's this sort of very Borgesian character who collects obscure dictionaries. And it's interesting that you point out, so there's Aunt Lolo in Daughters of the Air, and then Great Aunt Ruby in Dreams Under Glass. And then the question reminded me that the opening of my next book, there's a narrator that says, maybe this is a story for nieces. So I think I'm really interested in these ant figures, especially childless ants, this idea of passing down stories, right? Not from mother to daughter, but aunt to niece. And that's something I have to explore more. It's like, it's coming up, but it's not really something I've like explicitly journaled about or reflected on in writing. Thank you so much for asking about that. Yeah.
That reminds me of some great writing advice I heard from Anne Napolitano from one story where she was saying, pay attention to what you're curious about, what you keep going back to, what you're fixated on. Like imagine if you had this giant magnet board on your chest, and all the stuff that keeps sticking to your magnet board, and that's what you need to write about. So I guess in writing about aunts and nieces is in your future, or already in your present. Okay, and you have another question from Avi. Another recent novel, The New House by David Leo Rice, also takes its inspiration from Joseph Cornell. Is there something specific in your opinion about Cornell's work that speaks to this moment of time?
It's a really interesting question. I have to check out that book. I don't know about it, but Joseph Cornell, his art is so dreamy and filled with wonder. And I think certainly now in such a fraught time, there can be a balm, I think, to spending some time with art that's focused on something more dreamy. There is that, but there's also, in terms of, at least for for my book, the autobiographical material of his life, which is he also struggled with making art and making a living, right? He had, and even in the excerpt that I read, like he had these day jobs that would give him these terrible stomach aches, these terrible headaches. He had a lot of social anxiety. So I think for Binny, she relates to that as well. He was always collecting found objects, like things thrown out. I think there's something relatable about the ephemera that he was attracted to, and the ephemera in our time. I think we're constantly bombarded with ephemera, and it's, it can be hard to focus. And I think by, like focusing in on an object and allowing it to bring wonder into your life, I think there's something very appealing about that.
Okay, thanks. I don't know if there was other questions. I had more questions, so I'll ask a few. I know we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask Ellen, you mentioned that the hospital was very, believed in the moral treatment. They were part of the moral treatment movement, where you put people in a nice setting and you treat them with kindness. And even though we know today that's not necessarily, they weren't using, mental health guidelines as we know today, but was there a positive effect on the patients from at least that perspective? I was curious from the moral treatment, whatever it was called, moral treatment movement.
I think it's so hard to evaluate that. I mean, the hospital was built on a hill. It's a beautiful setting. And best sledding hill in town. But I think from the beginning, the overcrowding and underfunding was so profound that there wasn't even a chance to see if that kind of treatment would have any effect. It really wasn't until the 1950s when the psych meds started being used that they had any kind of treatment that didn't sound really almost medieval. Before that, cold water baths and, of course, electric shock and insulin shock. We all know the sort of outlines of what the historical therapies were. In interviewing people, one of the things that struck me was how much the people who worked at the hospital at all levels cared about the patients. So it really wasn't a Nurse Ratched kind of situation, although I'm sure there were individuals who perhaps were not as kind. But one attendant sat in my living room and told me how much she liked one particular patient who came home to her family for all of the holidays to share holiday meals. And then her friend who was sitting next to her on the sofa said, "Yeah, but you didn't like him so much the time he stabbed you in the arm with a pair of scissors." So I think it just was a really complicated, really, really complicated situation, and one in which individuals didn't have a whole lot of opportunity to make the difference they wanted to make because of how broken the mental health treatment system was and is.
Thank you. There's a question about whether your books are in paperback. And we know that the Thread Collectors is, but I think The Lost Women of Azalea Court and Dreams Under Glass, they're both in paperback. Is that right? Okay. And I will just end with, well, two things I want to end with. One is we have the next session already set. It's going to be our first in-person and on Zoom event on Monday, January 9th. Tomorrow I'm going to send around more information about all three of the books and how you can get them and how you can sign up for our next event. And the list of all the books that we've hosted at Literary Modiin. So please check that out. But mark your calendars, January 9th, it's a Monday. And I'm going to end with one last question for all four of you. Well, you have the option, okay, of two questions. We have a lot of writers on the call. And so I want to hear either the best writing advice you ever received or your favorite writing prompt. Anyone want to start?
It's a hard one.
Okay. Or if anybody listening has some good writing advice or a great prompt they want to put in the chat.
I'm sure your listeners have heard this before, but the thing that always I return to when I'm starting a new book is to write the book that you want to read. And I think about that every time I sit down to write. So it's true. If it's something you find interesting, something that would draw you into it, this subject matter, then that's a good start.
And I'm tied for two pieces of advice, if I can share two pieces that have stuck with me. One was from my professor in my MFA, Sean Wong. And this really helped me because I underwrite. Was wherever you're feeling closest in a story, whatever paragraph you feel closest to, double the length of that paragraph, which I think is just such a simple, accessible piece of writing advice. And then another piece of advice from a professor I've had, Heather McHugh, said, if you're stuck in a piece of writing, think about whatever would be most unholy, then write that. Which I think is funny advice that's maybe a little harder to do, but I like to have both of those in my mind, right? To be daring in your writing and also just to go deeper wherever you feel closest.
One of the things that I do when I'm stuck with a character is write a first-person monologue from that character, which starts with the phrase, "There's something I've never told you." And for me, that often opens up worlds that I didn't know about the character. And even if I don't end up using it, it often is a way to get moving again.
Love that. Shaunna, wait, I have to unmute you. Sorry.
I apologize. I live very near both a fire station and a police station, so I mute myself when things are going by. I'm the most debut author on the line, but I will say, if you don't think you have enough time to write, you do. I think that there are plenty of things we fill our time with that might not be as soul nourishing. So just look at your calendar and knock one thing off, and I think you'll find you have enough time. I wouldn't have thought that I could do this, but I have, and I will continue to do it in spite of holding down a couple of days jobs.
You're here. Yeah, I'm with you on the full-time plus day job and trying to squeeze in writing whenever whenever I have a minute. Okay, thank you. I want to thank everyone who's been on the call, and thank Alyson and Shaunna and Anca and Ellen. And wonderful to hear you read from your works and tell us about your writing processes. And I came away really inspired by listening to all of you, and I love the advice you all just shared. So thank you all. Look forward to reading your next books. And that's it. Have a great day, great night for everyone in Israel, and hope to see those of you in Israel at our in-person event and the rest of you joining us on Zoom. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, everybody.